In the world of elite military operations, there are moments when destiny calls out across a crowded room, seeking someone brave enough to answer. Sometimes that call comes in the form of a decorated SEAL captain standing before hundreds of aviators, his weathered face scanning the crowd for someone who doesn't exist in their records. Sometimes it comes when conventional wisdom says the mission is impossible, when every expert shakes their head and walks away. And sometimes, just sometimes, that call is answered by someone who was never supposed to be there in the first place. This is the story of what happens when the most classified mission in naval aviation history meets the most unlikely pilot in the room. It's about the moment when a career built in shadows steps into the light, when years of flying under the radar suddenly become the exact qualifications needed to save lives. It's about the choice between safety and service, between anonymity and duty, between staying hidden and standing up when it matters most. What you're about to read isn't just a story about military operations or daring rescues. It's about the people behind the missions that never make the headlines, the pilots who fly the routes that don't officially exist, and the moment when someone's carefully guarded secret becomes their greatest strength. It's about a woman who built her entire career on being invisible, only to discover that sometimes the most important thing you can do is be seen. The events that unfolded that day would challenge everything the military thought they knew about courage, capability, and who gets to be a hero. But before we dive into those extraordinary circumstances, you need to understand that this story begins in the most ordinary place imaginable. A routine briefing room on a Tuesday morning, where someone who wasn't supposed to be there was about to change everything. Captain Sarah Chen had perfected the art of being invisible. In a world where military aviators lived for recognition, medals, and the chance to tell war stories at the officers' club, she had spent 12 years making sure nobody noticed her at all. She sat in the back row of every briefing, spoke only when directly addressed, and had managed to fly more classified missions than anyone in the room, while maintaining a service record so clean, it was almost suspicious in its ordinariness. The briefing room at Naval Air Station Oceana was packed that Tuesday morning in March. Word had spread through the base that Captain Marcus Torres, a legendary SEAL team leader with 3 Bronze Stars and a reputation for impossible rescues, was personally selecting pilots for a classified operation. Torres stood at the front of the room like a force of nature, his presence commanding attention from every aviator present. His dark eyes swept across the crowd of eager faces, each pilot hoping to be chosen for what everyone assumed would be a career-defining mission. Sarah kept her head down, reviewing maintenance reports on her tablet. She wasn't supposed to be in this briefing at all. Her commanding officer had specifically told her to skip it, suggesting that someone with her particular expertise would be better served focusing on her regular duties. But Sarah had learned long ago that the best way to stay informed about potential threats to her carefully constructed cover was to be present when important decisions were being made. She glanced up briefly as Torres began speaking. His voice carried the kind of authority that came from leading men through hell and bringing them back alive. "I need a pilot for an extraction mission in hostile territory," he said, his words measured and deliberate. "The target is a deep cover intelligence asset who's been compromised. The location is a remote airfield and terrain that would challenge even our most experienced aviators. The enemy has sophisticated surface-to-air missile systems, electronic warfare capabilities, and ground forces that know we're coming." A murmur ran through the room. This was exactly the kind of high-stakes mission that could make careers. Sarah watched as the pilots around her sat up straighter, their competitive instincts fully engaged. She knew most of them by reputation, if not personally. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, who'd distinguished himself in 3 deployments and never met a mission he wouldn't volunteer for. Major Lisa Rodriguez, whose precision flying had earned her a slot with the Blue Angels before she'd returned to operational duties. Captain David Kim, whose dogfighting skills were legendary throughout the Pacific Fleet. Torres continued his briefing, outlining the challenges they'd face. The target location was a dirt airstrip carved into a mountainside, barely long enough for a light aircraft, and surrounded by peaks that would make approach and departure extremely hazardous. The weather window was narrow, with seasonal storms that could close in without warning. Intelligence suggested the enemy had moved mobile SAM units into the area specifically to prevent any rescue attempt. "I need someone who can fly in conditions that would ground most pilots," Torres said. "Someone who knows how to get in and out of places that don't officially exist. Someone who understands that this mission never happened, regardless of the outcome." Sarah felt an uncomfortable stirring in her chest. Every detail Torres described matched her unofficial specialty exactly. For 12 years, she'd been flying missions that didn't appear in any logbooks, landing on airstrips that weren't on any maps, and extracting people who were never supposed to be where they were in the first place. Her entire career had been built around the kind of flying Torres was describing. But that was precisely why she couldn't volunteer. Sarah's cover was too valuable to risk on a single mission, no matter how important. She was what the intelligence community called a grey pilot, someone who could move through hostile airspace without triggering the kind of attention that regular military aircraft attracted. Her aircraft didn't carry standard military markings, her flight plans were filed through civilian channels, and her very existence was known only to a small group of handlers who understood the value of having someone who could go anywhere without officially being there. The mission Torres was describing would put her directly in the spotlight, something she'd spent her entire career avoiding. Even if she survived the operation, the exposure would likely end her usefulness in her current role. She'd spent years building relationships with contacts in a dozen countries, developing cover identities that allowed her to operate freely in places where American military personnel were decidedly unwelcome. All of that would be compromised the moment she flew an official rescue mission. Torres was still talking, describing the timeline and the stakes. The intelligence asset they needed to extract had information that could prevent a terrorist attack on American soil, but his cover had been blown and hostile forces were closing in. They had maybe 48 hours before the target would either be captured or killed. Standard rescue protocols weren't an option because the enemy was expecting them and had prepared accordingly. "The pilot I'm looking for has experience with unconventional operations," Torres said. "Someone who's comfortable operating outside normal parameters and can adapt when plans fall apart. This isn't a mission for someone who needs everything to go according to the manual." Sarah's hands tightened on her tablet. Every word Torres spoke described her operational experience perfectly. She'd spent years flying into situations where the manual was more suggestion than requirement, where improvisation meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. She knew how to read terrain from satellite photos, how to calculate fuel consumption for routes that didn't exist, and how to land aircraft in spaces that engineers would swear were too small. But she also knew the cost of visibility. 3 months earlier, another grey pilot had been compromised during a routine extraction in Eastern Europe. Within weeks, his entire network had been rolled up, and 2 years of carefully cultivated intelligence sources had been lost. The intelligence community's ability to operate in that region had been set back by years, all because one pilot had been identified and traced back to his real employers. Around her, the other pilots were exchanging glances, each trying to gauge their chances of being selected. Sarah could see the calculations running through their minds, the career advancement that would come from a successful high-profile mission, the recognition, the boost to their service records. For most of them, this was the kind of opportunity they'd been training for their entire careers. For Sarah, it represented everything she'd been trying to avoid. Torres finished his briefing and announced that he'd be conducting individual interviews with potential candidates. Names were called, and pilots began filing out of the room for their chance to impress the SEAL captain. Sarah gathered her things, planning to slip out during the general exodus and return to her regular duties. She was almost to the door when Torres's voice cut through the noise of departing aviators. "Excuse me, Captain." Sarah froze. She turned slowly to find Torres looking directly at her, his dark eyes intense and knowing. "Captain Chen, isn't it? I'd like to speak with you." The room had emptied except for the two of them and a few stragglers still organizing their notes. Sarah felt exposed in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Torres approached her with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having his requests treated as orders. "I've been looking at service records," he said quietly, "and yours is interesting. 12 years of active duty, excellent fitness reports, qualified on 6 different aircraft types, and yet almost no mention of specific operations or deployments. That's unusual for someone with your experience level." Sarah kept her expression neutral. "I've been fortunate to serve in support roles, sir. Nothing particularly noteworthy." Torres smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Support roles that require top-secret clearance and special operations training? Support roles that have taken you to 3 continents in the past 2 years alone? He paused, studying her face. "Captain Chen, I've been in the special operations community long enough to recognize a cover story when I hear one. The question is whether you're the person I need for this mission." Sarah felt the familiar tension that came with walking the tightrope between truth and deception. Her cover had held up to scrutiny before, but Torres was asking questions that indicated he already knew more than he was letting on. "Sir, I'm not sure what you're implying, but my record speaks for itself."
"Your record speaks very carefully," Torres corrected.
"It says just enough to justify your security clearance and your assignment here, but not enough to draw attention to what you actually do. That kind of precision doesn't happen by accident." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'm not trying to expose your operations, Captain. I'm trying to determine if your particular skill set matches what I need." The weight of the moment pressed down on Sarah's shoulders. She could feel the conversation approaching a point where her carefully maintained anonymity would either be preserved or shattered entirely. Torres was offering her a choice, but it was the kind of choice that would define the rest of her career, regardless of which option she selected. "What exactly are you asking me, sir?" she said finally. Torres glanced around the empty briefing room. Then, back to her. "I'm asking if you're the pilot who can fly into a hostile mountain valley in bad weather, extract a compromised asset from a dirt strip that's barely long enough for a lawnmower, and get everyone out alive while the entire enemy air defense network is looking for you. I'm asking if you're someone who can do that kind of mission and then disappear back into whatever shadows you usually operate in." The directness of the question caught Sarah off guard. In 12 years of covert operations, she had never had someone lay out her actual capabilities so bluntly. It was simultaneously terrifying and oddly liberating to have her real work acknowledged by someone outside her immediate chain of command. "And if I were that person?" she asked carefully. "Then you'd be exactly who I need," Torres replied. "And I'd make sure that your participation in this mission stayed as invisible as the rest of your career. No medals, no commendations, no official recognition. Just the knowledge that you helped save the life of someone who's been risking everything to protect American interests." Sarah studied Torres's face, looking for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. She'd learned to read people quickly and accurately, skills that had kept her alive in situations where the wrong assessment could be fatal. What she saw in Torres's expression was something she recognized: the weight of responsibility for other people's lives and the willingness to do whatever was necessary to bring them home safely. The silence stretched between them as Sarah weighed her options. She could maintain her cover, decline politely, and return to the shadows where she'd spent her career. Or she could step forward and acknowledge what they both already knew: that she was probably the only pilot in the building with the experience necessary to pull off the mission Torres was describing. "I'd need to know more details," she said finally. "Operational parameters, timeline, support assets. The kind of information that would help someone assess whether the mission is feasible." Torres nodded, his expression showing the first hint of satisfaction she'd seen. "I can provide that, but once you hear the full briefing, you'll be committed to the operation one way or another, either as the pilot or as someone who has to keep quiet about what you've learned. Are you prepared for that level of involvement?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that her next words would change everything. For 12 years she'd been a ghost in the machine of American intelligence operations, invisible and invaluable precisely because no one knew she existed. Now she was being asked to step into the light, to risk everything she'd built for the chance to save someone she'd never met. "Yes, sir," she said quietly. "I'm prepared." The classified briefing room 3 levels below the main administration building felt like stepping into another world. Sarah had been in secure facilities before, but the level of security surrounding this operation was unlike anything in her experience. 2 armed guards flanked the entrance, and she'd had to surrender her phone, tablet, and even her fitness tracker before being allowed inside. The room itself was lined with copper mesh to prevent electronic eavesdropping, and a white noise generator hummed quietly in the background. Torres was waiting for her, along with 2 other individuals she didn't recognize. A woman in civilian clothes who introduced herself only as Ms. Patterson and carried herself with the quiet confidence of senior intelligence personnel. A Navy commander named Richards, whose uniform bore the insignia of Naval Intelligence, and whose handshake suggested he spent more time in gyms than behind desks. The small group represented resources and authority that extended far beyond a typical rescue operation. "What I'm about to tell you doesn't leave this room," Torres began without preamble. "The asset we need to extract is Dr. Folkwater, Alexei Petrov, a Russian scientist who's been providing intelligence to the West for the past 3 years. His information has prevented 2 major terrorist attacks and helped us track weapons smuggling networks across Eastern Europe. 48 hours ago, his cover was blown by a double agent we're still trying to identify. Ms. Patterson activated a large display screen that showed satellite imagery of mountainous terrain. The landscape looked forbidding even from space, with jagged peaks and narrow valleys that seemed to offer no safe passage for aircraft. Petrov is currently hiding at an abandoned mining facility in the Caucasus Mountains, approximately 40 kilometers from the Georgian border. The facility includes a dirt airstrip that was used for supply flights during Soviet times, but it's been inactive for over a decade. Sarah studied the images carefully, her trained eye automatically calculating approach angles and potential hazards. The airstrip was indeed barely adequate, carved into the side of a mountain with steep slopes on both sides and barely enough length for a landing and immediate takeoff. The surrounding terrain offered no alternatives. It was this strip or nothing. "What's the threat assessment?" Sarah asked. Commander Richards took over the briefing. "Russian intelligence has moved significant assets into the region. We've identified at least 3 mobile SAM sites, electronic warfare units, and approximately 200 ground personnel conducting search operations. They know Petrov is in the area, and they know we'll try to extract him. They're prepared for a conventional rescue attempt, which is why we're not conducting one, Torres added. Standard military aircraft would be detected and engaged long before reaching the target area. We need someone who can get in below their radar coverage and extract Petrov without triggering a full military response. Ms. Patterson pulled up additional images showing the mining facility in detail. The buildings were partially collapsed, and the entire complex had the look of a place that had been abandoned for years. Petrov has been in contact via emergency frequencies, but communication is intermittent due to the terrain and enemy jamming. His last message indicated he had supplies for approximately 72 hours, which gives us a narrow window. Sarah continued studying the tactical display, her mind automatically working through the problems she'd need to solve. The approach would require flying at extremely low altitude to avoid radar detection, navigating through mountain passes that left little room for error. The weather in the region was notoriously unpredictable, with sudden storms that could make the mountain valleys impassable. Even if she managed to reach the target location, landing on an unmaintained dirt strip in adverse conditions would test every skill she'd developed over 12 years of unconventional flying. "What aircraft are you proposing for this mission?" she asked. Torres gestured to Commander Richards, who activated another display showing technical specifications. Modified Beechcraft King Air 350, configured for special operations. Extended range fuel tanks, advanced navigation systems, defensive electronic countermeasures. The modifications reduce the radar cross-section and allow for operations in hostile airspace. Sarah recognized the aircraft type immediately. She'd flown similar planes on several occasions, appreciating their reliability and versatility. The King Air was large enough to carry passengers, but small enough to operate from improvised airstrips. With the right modifications, it could indeed slip through radar coverage that would detect larger military aircraft. The aircraft has been pre-positioned at a civilian airfield in Turkey, Richards continued. Your flight plan will show a routine cargo run to a freight company in Tbilisi. Once you cross into Georgian airspace, you'll deviate from the filed route and proceed to the extraction site. Total flight time should be approximately 4 hours, with about 30 minutes on the ground at the target location. 30 minutes? Sarah questioned. That's cutting it very close if there are any complications. It's the maximum time we can spend on the ground without significantly increasing the risk of detection. Ms. Patterson explained. Petrov has been briefed on the timeline. He'll be ready to move the moment you arrive. Torres leaned forward, his expression serious. Captain Chen, I need to be completely honest with you about the risks. This mission has a high probability of going sideways. If you're detected during the approach, you'll face immediate engagement from surface-to-air missiles and fighter aircraft. If complications arise on the ground, there's no backup plan and no quick reaction force standing by to assist. You'll be entirely on your own in hostile territory with no official support. The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Sarah had flown dangerous missions before, but never one where the margin for error was so small and the consequences of failure so severe. She found herself thinking about the careful balance she'd maintained throughout her career, the way she'd managed to operate in the shadows without ever taking risks that might expose her to this level of scrutiny. What about exfiltration routes, she asked. If the primary plan fails, what are my alternatives? Limited, Richards admitted. The terrain restricts your options significantly. There are 2 possible emergency landing sites within fuel range, but both would put you in Russian-controlled territory. Your best chance of survival would be to abort the mission and return to Turkey if you encounter problems before reaching the target, Ms. Patterson added. We've prepared emergency protocols and communication procedures, but the reality is that you'd be operating beyond our ability to provide meaningful assistance. This mission succeeds because you make it succeed, or it fails because the challenges prove insurmountable. Sarah appreciated their honesty even as it reinforced the magnitude of what they were asking. In her covert operations, she'd always had some form of backup plan, some way to extract herself if things went wrong. This mission offered no such safety net. Success meant bringing Petrov out alive, and failure likely meant death for both of them. Tell me about Petrov, she said. What should I expect when I meet him? Torres's expression softened slightly. He's a theoretical physicist, mid-50s, no military training but considerable survival skills developed during years of fieldwork in remote locations. He's been living under deep cover for 3 years, working as a mining consultant while feeding us intelligence on Russian weapons development programs. By all accounts, He's maintained his composure despite knowing his life is in constant danger. He volunteered for this, Miss Poorchild. Patterson added quietly. After the Soviet Union collapsed, he watched his country's scientific resources being used to develop weapons that could threaten global stability. He reached out to us because he believed the information he could provide would help prevent those weapons from being used against innocent people. The personal details helped Sarah understand what was truly at stake. This wasn't just an intelligence asset to be extracted. It was a man who'd risked everything to do what he believed was right, someone who'd spent 3 years living a lie, knowing that discovery meant death, because he thought the information he could provide would make the world safer. The intelligence he's provided has been invaluable, Richards continued. His reports helped us identify a plot to smuggle nuclear materials through Eastern European crime networks. Information he provided led to the arrest of 3 terrorist cells planning attacks on civilian targets. But his most recent intelligence suggests something much larger in development, something that could fundamentally alter the balance of power if it falls into the wrong hands. Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with accepting a mission that would test every skill she'd ever developed. The tactical challenges were significant, but she'd faced difficult flying conditions before. The real weight came from understanding that failure wouldn't just mean the loss of a valuable intelligence source. It would mean abandoning someone who'd already sacrificed everything to help protect American interests. "I need to know about weather conditions and timing," she said. "What's our window for optimal conditions?" Miss Patterson consulted her tablet. "Weather patterns suggest a brief clear period beginning approximately 18 hours from now, lasting perhaps 6 hours before the next storm system moves through the region. That gives us a narrow but viable window for the operation. And if we miss that window, the next opportunity wouldn't come for at least a week, assuming Petrov survives that long in hiding. Intelligence suggests Russian forces are conducting systematic searches of the area. They'll find him eventually." Torres stood and walked to the tactical display, pointing to specific features of the terrain. "I've planned similar operations in equally challenging environments. The key is precise timing, careful route planning, and the ability to adapt when conditions change. Based on your service record and the missions I suspect you've flown, I believe you have the skills necessary to succeed." Sarah found herself studying the faces of the 3 people who'd briefed her. She saw determination, professional competence, and something else that surprised her. A genuine belief that she was the right person for this mission. In 12 years of covert operations, she'd rarely received direct feedback on her performance. Her handlers kept her at arm's length, providing mission parameters and extracting results, without much personal interaction. These people were asking her to risk everything, but they were also expressing confidence in abilities she'd begun to take for granted. "If I accept this mission," she said carefully, "what guarantees do I have that my cover won't be compromised? My effectiveness in my current role depends on anonymity. Your participation will be classified at the highest levels, Ms." Patterson assured her. "Only the people in this room and a small number of senior officials will know you are involved. If the mission succeeds, there will be no official record of your participation. If it fails," she didn't finish the sentence, but the implication was clear. If the mission failed, Sarah's cover would be the least of her concerns. Torres returned to the table and sat down across from her. "Captain Chen, I've led special operations teams for 15 years. I've asked people to risk their lives on missions where success was far from guaranteed. I've never asked anyone to take on a challenge I didn't believe they could handle. Based on everything I know about your capabilities, I believe you're the only pilot who can pull this off." The room fell silent as Sarah weighed her final decision. She thought about Dr. Petrov, hiding in an abandoned mining facility with Russian forces closing in around him. She thought about the intelligence he'd provided and the lives that had been saved because of his courage. She thought about the careful balance she'd maintained throughout her career and the cost of stepping into the spotlight. But mostly, she thought about the fact that sometimes the most important missions were the ones that scared you the most. "When do we begin?" she asked. Torres smiled for the first time since the briefing began. "We launch in 16 hours. The civilian airport outside Ankara felt surreal at 4 in the morning. Sarah walked across the tarmac wearing jeans, a leather jacket, and civilian sunglasses, carrying papers that identified her as Amanda Walsh, a cargo pilot working for a freight company based in Malta. The transformation from military officer to commercial aviator was complete, down to the smallest details, including a backstopped identity that would hold up under casual scrutiny. The modified King Air 350 sat in a maintenance hangar, looking exactly like what it was supposed to be, a well-maintained cargo aircraft owned by a legitimate freight company. Only someone with extensive knowledge of aircraft systems would notice the subtle modifications. The additional fuel tanks hidden in the cargo bay, the enhanced navigation equipment disguised as standard avionics, and the electronic countermeasures system concealed within normal-looking antenna arrays. Torres met her at the hangar entrance, also dressed in civilian clothes and carrying identification that showed him as a mining equipment sales representative. His transformation was as complete as hers, though Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders that suggested he was more comfortable in military gear than business suits. "Final weather check shows conditions deteriorating faster than expected," he said without preamble. "The window for optimal flying weather has moved up by approximately 3 hours. We need to be airborne within the next 30 minutes to reach the target area before the storms close in." Sarah felt the familiar pre-mission adrenaline beginning to build in her system. She'd learned years ago to channel that energy into focused preparation rather than nervous anxiety. "Any changes to the tactical situation?" "Russian forces have expanded their search perimeter, but they're still concentrating on areas closer to the border. Our route should take us around their primary zones of activity." Torres handed her a sealed envelope. "Final navigation updates and communication frequencies. Petrov's last contact was 6 hours ago. He confirmed he'll be ready for immediate extraction." Inside the hangar, Sarah began her pre-flight inspection with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through hundreds of dangerous missions. The King Air was indeed beautifully maintained, with every system functioning exactly as specified. The modifications had been installed by professionals who understood that pilot survival depended on equipment reliability. The cargo bay had been configured to carry 2 passengers in relative comfort, with proper seating and safety equipment that met civilian aviation standards. Medical supplies were stored in easily accessible containers, along with survival gear appropriate for the environment they'd be flying through. Someone had put considerable thought into every detail of the mission planning. "The aircraft handles exactly like a standard King Air," Torres explained as Sarah completed her inspection. "The additional weight from fuel and equipment affects performance slightly, but nothing that should impact your flying.
The defensive systems are automated and will activate if we're targeted by radar or missiles."
Sarah climbed into the pilot's seat and began running through the electronic checklist. The avionics suite was indeed sophisticated, with GPS navigation accurate to within meters and weather radar that could detect storm systems hundreds of miles away. Communication equipment included both civilian and military frequencies with encryption capabilities for sensitive transmissions. "Ground control has cleared us for immediate departure," Torres said, settling into the co-pilot seat. "Flight plan shows a direct route to Tbilisi with an estimated arrival time that gives us perfect cover for the actual mission timeline." Sarah started the engines and began taxi procedures, her mind already shifting into the focused calm that characterized her approach to dangerous flying. The pre-dawn darkness provided excellent cover for their departure, and air traffic was light enough that their movement wouldn't attract unusual attention. "Once we're airborne, I'll need about 20 minutes to review the final approach routes," she told Torres. "The terrain around the target area is challenging enough without surprises." The takeoff from Ankara went smoothly, with the King Air lifting into clear skies that showed stars still visible on the western horizon. Sarah climbed to cruising altitude and established contact with Turkish air traffic control, following her filed flight plan exactly, while privately calculating the point where she'd need to deviate toward their actual destination. As they crossed into international airspace, Torres activated the secure communication system and established contact with their mission handlers. The brief exchange confirmed that conditions at the target area remained stable, with no indication that Russian forces had detected Petrov's location or anticipated the rescue attempt. "Intelligence update shows enemy air patrols have increased, but they're still focused on the border regions," Torres relayed. "Our approach route should keep us clear of their primary search areas." Sarah adjusted their heading slightly, beginning the gradual course change that would take them toward Georgian airspace. The navigation system showed their position precisely, but she also kept track using traditional methods that wouldn't fail if the electronics were compromised. In hostile territory, redundancy meant survival. The flight across eastern Turkey passed without incident, though Sarah remained constantly alert for any signs of unusual air traffic or ground-based threats. The defensive systems remained quiet, indicating they weren't being tracked by hostile radar systems. Still, she knew that situation could change instantly as they approached more dangerous airspace. "Beginning descent for the approach phase," she announced as they crossed into Georgian territory. "From this point forward, we'll be flying below radar coverage and maintaining radio silence except for emergencies." Torres acknowledged and switched the communication system to emergency-only mode. The cabin fell quiet except for the steady drone of the twin turboprop engines and the occasional beep from navigation equipment. Sarah reduced altitude gradually, bringing the King Air down to barely 1,000 feet above the mountainous terrain. The landscape below was spectacular and forbidding. Jagged peaks stretched in every direction, many still snow-covered despite the advancing spring season. Deep valleys cut between the mountains like knife wounds, some so narrow that aircraft wings would nearly brush the canyon walls. Sarah had studied the terrain extensively during mission planning, but seeing it firsthand emphasized how little margin for error the approach would allow. 30 minutes to target, Taurus reported quietly. Weather radar shows storm cells building to the west, but they shouldn't reach the area until after our extraction window. Sarah nodded. Her attention focused on the increasingly challenging flying conditions. The mountain valleys created significant turbulence, requiring constant adjustments to maintain altitude and heading. The King Air handled well despite the additional weight, but she could feel the aircraft working harder in the thin air and unpredictable wind currents. As they approached the final approach corridor, Sarah began the most dangerous phase of the entire mission. The route to the abandoned mining facility required threading through a series of mountain passes, each one narrower than the last. GPS navigation helped, but the terrain features were so dramatic that visual flying skills became essential for safe passage. Valley entrance coming up in 2 minutes, Torres announced. Satellite imagery shows the approach clear, but visibility conditions may be reduced by morning fog. Sarah could see what he meant. Wisps of fog clung to the higher elevations, and the valley they needed to follow disappeared into a grey haze that obscured the landing site. She'd flown in similar conditions before, but never with stakes this high and terrain this unforgiving. The King Air entered the final valley at barely 500 feet above the rocky floor. Sheer granite walls rose on both sides, creating a natural corridor that offered no room for navigation errors. Sarah reduced power slightly, maintaining just enough airspeed to avoid stalling while giving herself maximum control authority for the delicate flying ahead. Visual contact with the facility, Torres called out. Airstrip appears clear, no visible activity on the ground. Sarah could see the abandoned mining complex ahead, a cluster of partially collapsed buildings scattered across a natural shelf in the mountainside. The dirt airstrip was exactly as shown in satellite photos, short, rough, and bordered by steep drops on both sides. It looked barely adequate for landing a small aircraft, let alone taking off again with additional passengers. Beginning final approach, Sarah announced. Secure any loose items and prepare for a firm landing. The approach required every skill she'd developed over 12 years of unconventional flying. The airstrip slope worked in her favor for landing, but would make takeoff significantly more challenging. Crosswinds created by the surrounding peaks buffeted the aircraft unpredictably, requiring constant corrections to maintain the proper glide path. Sarah touched down firmly about a third of the way down the runway, immediately applying maximum braking while maintaining directional control on the rough surface. The King Air decelerated quickly, coming to a stop with about 200 feet of runway remaining. She kept the engines running while scanning the surrounding area for any signs of hostile activity. "We're down safely," she reported, beginning taxi to the extraction point. The mining facility looked even more desolate from ground level. Years of abandonment had taken their toll, with rust staining every metal surface and vegetation beginning to reclaim the disturbed earth around the buildings. Sarah taxied carefully toward the largest structure, where Dr. Rio Petrov was supposedly waiting for extraction. Torres was already unbuckling his harness and preparing to leave the aircraft. "I'll make contact with Petrov and escort him to the plane. Keep the engines running and be ready for immediate takeoff. If you see anything suspicious, don't wait for me to return." Sarah watched through the side window as Torres jogged toward the main building, his movement quick and purposeful despite the bulky civilian clothes. She maintained her scan of the surrounding area, looking for any indication that their arrival had been detected or that enemy forces were moving to intercept them. The minutes stretched with agonizing slowness. Every sound seemed amplified in the thin mountain air, from the steady idle of the turboprop engines to the whistle of wind through the abandoned structures. Sarah checked her watch repeatedly, aware that every second on the ground increased their risk of discovery. A movement near the building entrance caught her attention. Torres emerged with another figure, an older man wearing a heavy coat and carrying what appeared to be a small backpack. Even from a distance, Sarah could see the exhaustion in the man's posture and the way he moved with the careful steps of someone who'd been surviving on minimal food and sleep. Dr. Care. Alexei Petrov looked exactly like the photographs in his intelligence file, though 3 years of living under deep cover had clearly taken their toll. His face was gaunt, his hair grey and unkempt, and his clothes hung loose on a frame that had lost considerable weight. But his eyes were alert and focused as Torres guided him quickly toward the aircraft. Sarah opened the cabin door as the two men approached, noting how Petrov moved with the quick efficiency of someone who understood the urgency of their situation. He climbed into the passenger compartment without hesitation, settling into one of the specially configured seats while Torres secured his minimal luggage. "Dr. Petrov, welcome aboard," Sarah called back to him. "We'll have you out of here in just a few minutes." The Russian scientist nodded gratefully. "Thank you for coming," he said in accented but clear English. "I was beginning to think I might die in this place." Torres completed his safety check and returned to the co-pilot seat. "We're ready for immediate departure. No signs of hostile activity, but I'd rather not test our luck by staying any longer than necessary." Sarah was already beginning taxi procedures, turning the King Air around on the narrow strip and positioning for takeoff. The wind had picked up since their arrival, and she could see storm clouds building over the western peaks. Their weather window was closing faster than anticipated. "Takeoff will be challenging due to the slope and altitude," she warned her passengers. "The climb out will be steep and will experience significant turbulence until we clear the surrounding peaks." She advanced the throttles to take off power and released the brakes, feeling the King Air begin its acceleration down the rough dirt surface. The uphill slope worked against them now, requiring maximum engine power to achieve flying speed before running out of runway. The aircraft lifted off with barely 50 feet of strip remaining, climbing steeply into the mountain air while buffeted by wind currents that seemed determined to push them into the surrounding granite walls. Sarah held the climb attitude precisely, trading airspeed for altitude, while navigating between the peaks that rose on all sides, clear of immediate terrain. Torres reported as they climbed above the highest nearby ridges. No radar emissions detected, no signs of pursuit.
Sarah began a gradual turn toward their exit route, still climbing to reach safe altitude for the flight back to Turkey.
The storm clouds were definitely building faster than forecast, and she could see lightning flickering in the distance. They'd completed the extraction just in time. "Dr. Petrov," she called back to her passenger, "how are you feeling? Do you need any medical attention?" The scientist managed a weak smile. "I am tired and hungry, but very much alive thanks to both of you. The information I carry will be worth the risks you took to retrieve it." As the King Air climbed towards cruising altitude, Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The most dangerous part of the mission was complete, and they were safely airborne with their package secured. But she also knew that the flight home would present its own challenges, and they weren't safe until they touched down in Turkish airspace. Behind them, the abandoned mining facility disappeared into the mountain haze, returning to the silence that had claimed it for over a decade. Ahead lay the long flight back to safety, carrying a man whose courage had already helped prevent terrorist attacks and whose latest intelligence might be even more valuable than the risks they'd taken to extract him. The storm was coming, but they were already racing ahead of it, carrying hope in the form of one brave scientist who'd risked everything to do what he believed was right. The first indication that their extraction hadn't gone unnoticed came 20 minutes into the flight home. Sarah was maintaining radio silence and flying at low altitude through the mountain valleys when the aircraft's defensive system suddenly activated, with a series of urgent electronic warnings. The threat detection display lit up with multiple radar contacts, indicating that they were being actively tracked by ground-based surveillance systems. "We've got company," Torres said grimly, his eyes fixed on the threat assessment screen. "Multiple search radars have acquired our position, and I'm seeing missile guidance frequencies starting to paint us." Sarah immediately pushed the throttles forward and began evasive maneuvering, using the mountainous terrain to mask their position from the tracking systems. The King Air's electronic countermeasures activated automatically, attempting to jam the hostile radars and confuse any missile guidance systems that might be targeting them. "How did they find us so quickly?" she asked, banking sharply to follow a narrow canyon that would provide temporary concealment. "Best guess is that they had sensors monitoring the mining facility," Torres replied, working frantically with the communication equipment to establish contact with their mission handlers. "They probably detected our takeoff and vectored search assets to our general area." Dr. Petrov, strapped into his passenger seat, looked pale but determined. "I am sorry to have brought this danger upon you," he said quietly. "Perhaps I should not have asked for extraction." "You did exactly the right thing," Sarah called back to him. "Now let's focus on getting everyone home safely." The defensive systems chimed again, this time with a more urgent warning tone. The threat display showed surface-to-air missile sites had activated their guidance radars and were attempting to establish firing solutions. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, initiating a series of evasive maneuvers designed to break radar lock and prevent successful missile engagement. "SAM sites are going active," Torres reported. "I count at least 3 separate systems trying to track us, probably mobile units that moved into position after our departure was detected. Sarah dove the King Air into a steep-sided valley, flying barely 100 feet above a mountain stream while granite walls rose thousands of feet on both sides. The terrain provided excellent concealment from radar, but it also trapped them in a corridor with limited escape routes. She had to balance the need for protection against the risk of being cornered in terrain that offered no alternatives. "Can you raise our handlers on the emergency frequency?" she asked Torres. "We need to know if there are friendly assets in the area that can provide support." Torres worked with the secure communication system, finally establishing weak contact with their mission control center. The conversation was brief and conducted in coded language that would be meaningless to anyone intercepting the transmission. "No immediate support available," he relayed after completing the call. "We're on our own until we reach Turkish airspace. Estimate 30 minutes to the border at current speed." 30 minutes felt like an eternity when flying through hostile territory with multiple missile systems trying to destroy them. Sarah continued using the terrain for concealment, following valleys and staying below ridgelines whenever possible. The technique worked to prevent radar lock, but it also limited their speed and forced them to fly a longer route towards safety. The next threat came from an unexpected direction. The aircraft's radar warning receiver detected airborne search radar, indicating that fighter aircraft had been scrambled to intercept them. Sarah's heart rate spiked as she realized that surface-to-air missiles were only part of their problem. Enemy fighters would have speed and maneuverability advantages that would make escape far more difficult. "Two aircraft approaching from the northeast," Torres called out, his voice tight with tension. "Looks like they're trying to intercept our route to the border." Sarah immediately changed course, turning south toward a different valley system that might throw off the pursuing fighters. The King Air wasn't built for air-to-air combat, but its smaller size and ability to fly through terrain that would challenge military jets gave them some advantages in a pursuit situation. The radio suddenly crackled with a transmission in Russian, clearly directed at their aircraft. Sarah didn't speak the language, but the tone was unmistakably authoritative and demanding. She maintained radio silence, knowing that any response would confirm their identity and provide additional information for enemy forces to track. "They're ordering us to land at a Russian airfield," Torres translated. "Standard intercept procedures for aircraft in violation of their airspace." "Are we actually in Russian territory?" Sarah asked, checking her navigation display while continuing evasive maneuvers. "Negative, we're still in Georgian airspace. But they're probably claiming hot pursuit rights or some other justification for the intercept." The pursuing fighters were gaining ground despite Sarah's best efforts to use terrain for concealment. The King Air's maximum speed was significantly lower than military jets, and the additional weight from fuel and passengers further reduced their performance. She needed to find another way to evade pursuit before the fighters closed within weapons range. "How far to the Turkish border?" she asked. 22 minutes at current speed, but the fighters will intercept us in less than 10 minutes if we maintain this heading." Sarah studied the tactical display, looking for options that might give them a chance of reaching safety. The terrain ahead offered several possible routes, but all of them would require flying through areas where the pursuing aircraft would have clear shots. She needed to find a way to either lose the pursuit or make engagement too risky for the enemy pilots. "There," she said suddenly, pointing to a feature on the navigation display. "That valley system leads toward a major hydroelectric dam. If we can reach that area, the fighters won't risk weapons engagement because of the potential for collateral damage." Torres studied the route she was proposing.
"It's a longer path to the border, and it takes us through some very challenging terrain. Are you sure the King Air can handle those mountain passes?"
"It's better than getting shot down in open airspace," Sarah replied, banking hard toward the new route.
"Hold on, this is going to be a rough ride." The valley she'd selected was indeed challenging, with narrow passages between towering peaks and sudden elevation changes that tested both aircraft performance and pilot skill. But it also provided excellent concealment from the pursuing fighters, whose larger size made them reluctant to follow into the most restricted passages. "Radar contact is intermittent," Torres reported. "The terrain is breaking up their tracking, but they're still out there." Sarah pushed the King Air through a series of tight turns that followed the natural contours of the mountain landscape. The aircraft was approaching its performance limits in the thin air and turbulent conditions, but it responded precisely to her control inputs. Years of flying in similar conditions had given her an almost intuitive feel for how much the aircraft could handle. Dr. Petrov had remained quiet during the pursuit, but Sarah could see in her mirrors that he was gripping his armrests tightly. Despite his fear, he'd made no complaints about the violent maneuvering required to evade their pursuers. "How are you doing back there, Doctor?" she called to him during a brief moment of straight and level flight. I am thinking that perhaps my laboratory was not so dangerous after all, he replied with surprising humor. But I would rather face these risks than return to Russian custody. The comment reminded Sarah of what was truly at stake. This wasn't just about evading pursuit or completing a successful mission. Dr. Petrov had spent 3 years risking his life to provide intelligence that protected innocent people from terrorist attacks. If they were captured or killed, that source of information would be lost permanently. 15 minutes to the border, Torres announced. But we've got a new problem. Ground-based air defense units have moved to block our most direct route to Turkey. Sarah checked the threat display and saw that he was right. Mobile SAM units had repositioned themselves along the valleys that provided the most direct path to safety. The enemy was adapting their tactics, trying to force the fleeing aircraft into areas where they could be engaged successfully. Alternative routes? She asked. There's a pass about 10 kilometers north of our current position. It's higher altitude and the weather looks questionable, but it might be our best option. Sarah adjusted course toward the alternative route, climbing to gain altitude for the mountain pass. The change in heading would add several minutes to their flight time, but avoiding the missile sites was worth the delay. As they climbed, turbulence increased and visibility began to deteriorate due to the approaching storm system. Weather radar shows heavy precipitation moving in fast, Torres reported. We're going to be flying through some serious weather if we take this route. Better than flying through a missile barrage, Sarah replied, continuing the climb toward the pass. The pursuing fighters had fallen back slightly during the low-level terrain flying, but they reappeared on radar as soon as the King Air climbed above the surrounding peaks. Sarah could see them in the distance, maintaining position while probably coordinating with ground controllers about the best way to intercept their target. They're not engaging, Torres observed, probably waiting for us to clear the mountains where they'd have a cleaner shot.
Or they're hoping to force us into the SAM sites that are waiting ahead, Sarah added.
The mounting pass appeared through the haze ahead, a narrow gap between snow-covered peaks that looked barely wide enough for aircraft passage. Weather conditions were indeed deteriorating rapidly, with low clouds and precipitation that would make navigation increasingly difficult. But it represented their best chance of reaching Turkish airspace ahead of their pursuers. Beginning approach to the pass, Sarah announced. This is going to be challenging even without people shooting at us. She reduced power slightly and began the delicate approach to the mountain gap, using every available navigation aid to maintain proper course in the deteriorating visibility. The King Air bucked and pitched in the turbulent air, requiring constant control inputs to maintain stable flight. Radar contact lost on the fighters, Torres reported. The weather is interfering with their tracking systems too. That was the first good news they'd received since the pursuit began. If the storm system was degrading enemy radar coverage, it might provide the concealment they needed to escape, but flying through the mountain pass in these conditions would test Sarah's skills to their absolute limit. The walls of the pass rose on both sides, barely visible through the swirling snow and cloud. Sarah flew entirely on instruments, trusting her navigation system while constantly cross-checking with visual references whenever they appeared through the weather. The margin for error was virtually zero. Any deviation from the precise flight path would result in collision with terrain. Pass transit complete, Torres announced with obvious relief as they emerged from the narrow gap. Turkish border is 8 minutes ahead. Sarah began a gradual descent toward the lower altitudes that would take them out of the worst weather. Behind them, the storm was building into a major system that would make pursuit increasingly difficult for the enemy fighters. Ahead lay the safety of Turkish airspace and the successful completion of a mission that had seemed impossible just hours before. Dr. Petrov, she called back to her passenger. We're almost home. The Russian scientist managed a tired smile. I begin to understand why they chose you for this mission, Captain. You fly like someone who refuses to be defeated. As they crossed into Turkish airspace, Sarah finally allowed herself to believe that they'd actually succeeded. The extraction was complete. Dr. Petrov was safe, and the intelligence he carried would continue to help protect innocent lives. But she also knew that this mission had changed everything about her, carefully maintained anonymity. There was no going back to the shadows now. The landing in Ankara came as the sun was setting behind the Turkish mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that seemed impossibly peaceful after the morning's terror. Sarah taxied the King Air toward the same maintenance hangar where their mission had begun, noting the small crowd of officials waiting near the building entrance. What had started as a covert extraction was ending with considerably more visibility than anyone had planned. Doctor. Alexei Petrov looked exhausted but alert as Torres helped him from the aircraft. 3 years of living under deep cover, followed by hours of pursuit through hostile airspace, had taken their toll. But the Russian scientist moved with the dignity of someone who understood the significance of what they'd accomplished together. "Captain Chen," he said, taking her hand as she completed her post-flight inspection, "I cannot adequately express my gratitude for the risks you took today. Without your skill and courage, I would certainly be dead or captured by now." Sarah found herself moved by the simple sincerity of his words. In 12 years of covert operations, she'd rarely received direct thanks from the people she'd helped extract or transport. Most of her missions ended with brief debriefings and immediate return to operational anonymity. This felt different, more personal somehow. "You did the hard part, Doctor," she replied, "living undercover for 3 years, maintaining your mission while knowing the risks. What we did today was just a few hours of dangerous flying. Miss..." Patterson emerged from the hangar, accompanied by several individuals Sarah didn't recognize. The presence of senior officials suggested that the intelligence Petrov carried was indeed as valuable as Torres had indicated. There would be extensive debriefings ahead, careful analysis of the information that had cost so much to obtain. The extraction was a complete success, Torres reported to Patterson. Captain Chen's flying made the difference between mission completion and disaster. Without her skills, we never would have made it through that pursuit. Sarah felt uncomfortable with the praise, especially with so many people listening. For years, her successes had been noted in classified files that few people ever read. Public recognition, even within the intelligence community, felt foreign and somehow dangerous. Patterson approached Sarah directly, her expression serious but respectful. "Captain, what you accomplished today goes far beyond normal operational parameters. The intelligence Dr. Petrov has provided will prevent attacks that could have killed hundreds of innocent people. Your country owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." "I was just doing my job," Sarah replied. Meaning it. Despite the extraordinary circumstances, the mission had felt like a natural extension of the work she'd been doing throughout her career. The stakes had been higher and the risks greater, but the fundamental challenge remained the same. Get in, complete the objective, get out alive. "Your job just became significantly more complicated," Patterson said quietly. "Word of today's operation will reach certain circles despite our security precautions. Your cover may be compromised, and your effectiveness in your current role will likely be reduced." Sarah had been expecting this conversation since the moment Torres first approached her in the briefing room. The successful extraction came with a cost that extended far beyond the immediate risks of the mission itself. Her years of careful anonymity were ending, and she'd need to find new ways to serve her country's interests. "What are my options?" she asked. "Several possibilities," Patterson replied. "We could arrange a new identity and assignment that would allow you to continue covert operations in a different region. Or you could transition to training other pilots in the specialized skills you've demonstrated. There's also the option of moving into more traditional military aviation roles, where your experience would be valuable." Torres joined the conversation, his expression showing the respect of one professional for another. "There's another option we should discuss. The special operations community has been looking for someone with your combination of skills to develop new extraction and infiltration protocols. You could help train the next generation of pilots who'll face similar challenges." The weight of decision settled on Sarah's shoulders like a familiar burden. She'd spent 12 years building expertise in a highly specialized field, becoming someone who could go anywhere and extract anyone, under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. The question now was how to use those skills in a world where her anonymity was no longer guaranteed. Dr. Petrov, who had been listening quietly to the conversation, stepped forward. "If I may offer an observation," he said carefully, "the courage and skill I witnessed today should not be hidden away. There are others who need extraction from dangerous situations, others whose information could save lives. Perhaps your visibility could become an asset rather than a liability." His words carried the weight of someone who'd seen firsthand how intelligence operations could protect innocent people. Sarah found herself considering possibilities she'd never contemplated before. What if stepping out of the shadows allowed her to help more people rather than fewer? "I need time to think about this," she said finally. "The mission is complete, Doctor. Petrov is safe, and that's what matters right now. Everything else can be decided later." Patterson nodded understandingly. "Take all the time you need, Captain. Your service record speaks for itself. And whatever you decide, you'll have the full support of the intelligence community." As the various officials escorted Dr. Deprivat, Dr. Paxton, Petrov toward a secure transportation that would take him to extensive debriefings, Torres remained behind with Sarah. The SEAL captain looked tired but satisfied in a way that came from successfully completing a mission that had seemed impossible at the outset.
"You know," he said, "I've worked with a lot of pilots over the years. Some were technically proficient, some were brave under fire, and some had good judgment under pressure. You're the first person I've met who combined all three qualities to this degree." Sarah felt heat rising in her cheeks. Praise from someone of Torres's reputation meant more than she wanted to admit.
You took the same risks I did, Captain.
We all did what was necessary. Maybe, Torres replied. But not everyone could have flown through that mountain pass in a storm while enemy fighters were trying to intercept us. That kind of flying goes beyond training or experience. That's pure skill combined with the kind of courage that can't be taught. As they walked toward the hangar exit, Sarah found herself reflecting on the day's events. 18 hours earlier, she'd been a ghost in the military aviation system, someone whose very existence was known only to a small group of handlers. Now she was being praised by senior officials and offered opportunities that would fundamentally change her career trajectory. The irony wasn't lost on her that stepping forward to help save one man's life had forced her to abandon the anonymity that had defined her professional identity. But as she thought about Dr. Lapet, Petrov's courage in living undercover for 3 years, and Torres's willingness to risk everything on a mission that could have easily failed, she began to understand that sometimes the most important thing you could do was be seen. 3 days later, Sarah sat in her quarters at Naval Air Station Oceana, reading through the official mission reports that would become part of her service record. The documents were heavily classified, but they represented the first time her actual accomplishments had been formally documented. After 12 years of invisible service, she finally had proof of what she'd been doing.
The phone rang, interrupting her review of the paperwork.
The voice on the other end was familiar. Patterson, calling with an update on Dr. Kneller.
Petrov's debriefings and a follow-up question about Sarah's decision regarding her future assignment. The intelligence he provided has exceeded our most optimistic expectations, Patterson reported. We've already prevented one terrorist attack based on his information, and there are several ongoing operations that should disrupt weapons smuggling networks across Eastern Europe.
I'm glad to hear that, Sarah replied, meaning it sincerely.
Knowing that the risks they'd taken were producing tangible results made everything worthwhile. Have you given any more thought to your next assignment? Patterson asked. The training position I mentioned is still available, and there's growing interest in developing a specialized unit for high-risk extractions. Sarah had indeed been thinking about her options, weighing the advantages of continued covert operations against the possibility of helping train other pilots to handle similar missions. The events of the past few days had shown her that her skills were more valuable than she'd realized, and that stepping out of the shadows might allow her to help more people rather than fewer. I'd like to know more about the training position, she said. If my experience can help other pilots handle these kinds of missions more safely and effectively, that seems like the best use of my skills. Patterson's satisfaction was evident even over the phone. I'll arrange for you to meet with the program developers next week. I think you'll find the opportunity both challenging and rewarding. After the call ended, Sarah returned to her review of the mission reports. The documents told the story of a successful extraction, but they couldn't capture the personal transformation that had occurred during those critical hours. She'd started the mission as someone who'd spent her career avoiding recognition, and she'd ended it as someone willing to step forward when called upon. The knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Torres, dressed in civilian clothes and carrying a bottle of wine. I figured you might want to celebrate properly, he said with a grin. Successful missions deserve proper recognition, even if it has to be private. They sat on her small balcony, watching the sunset over the Chesapeake Bay, while sharing the wine and talking about the mission that had changed both their careers. Torres told her about the commendation that would be added to his record, recognition for developing and executing an extraction plan that had seemed impossible to most observers. The interesting thing, he said, is that this mission has opened up new possibilities for special operations. Having a pilot who can handle these kinds of extractions means we can reach people in situations where we previously had no options. Sarah raised her glass in a small toast. To Dr. Benny Tobel. To Dr. Benny Petrov, she said. And to everyone else who's willing to risk everything to do what's right. To courage, Torres replied, wherever we find it. As the stars appeared over the Virginia coast, Sarah reflected on the path that had brought her to this moment. She'd spent 12 years perfecting the art of being invisible, only to discover that sometimes the most important thing you could do was step forward and be seen. The mission was complete, but in many ways, her real work was just beginning. 6 months later, Captain Sarah Chen stood before a classroom of military aviators at the Navy's Special Operations Training Facility. The students represented the best pilots from across the services, men and women who'd volunteered for the most challenging and dangerous flying assignments the military had to offer. Today we're going to talk about extraction operations in hostile territory, she began, her voice carrying the authority that came from actual experience. The scenarios you'll face will test every skill you've developed, and success will depend on your ability to adapt when everything goes wrong. On the wall behind her hung a detailed map showing the kind of terrain where impossible missions became possible with the right combination of skill, courage, and determination. It was the same map that had guided her through her own transformation from shadow operator to visible leader. The mission that had started with a SEAL captain calling out for a low-profile pilot had evolved into something much larger, a training program that would prepare the next generation of aviators to handle the impossible extractions that saved lives and protected innocent people around the world. Sarah looked out at the eager faces of her students and smiled. She was no longer invisible, but she'd found something better, the chance to help others develop the skills they'd need to answer when courage called their names. The story that began with someone stepping forward when no one else could had become a legacy of preparation, ensuring that there would always be someone ready to answer when the impossible became necessary. The SEAL captain called out for a low-profile pilot. She stepped forward.